Hey, what's up YouTube? Welcome to the third video of this three-part series where I walk you through my process of creating this cool little boat simulation. In the last two episodes I explained how I built a buoyancy system using Niagara and a foam capture system using a scene capture component and a few neat tricks. In today's video I'm going to do a breakdown of the last missing piece of the puzzle, this complex splash system I built using Niagara. Just a heads up, yes, it's somewhat complex and so this video is really not meant for beginners. I'll sure do my best to explain things as much as possible, but if you're new to Niagara, it might be a bit much still. Making this video as a step-by-step tutorial for beginners would be pretty much impossible, so I'll stick with my usual breakdown approach. Apologize if that's disappointing to some of you, again I'll do my best to make this as comprehensible as possible. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, this Niagara system is built using two emitters. In a nutshell, this first emitter keeps track of data over time, and that second emitter reads from that one to decide if a splash should be spawned at a given location and time, and if so, compute how big it should be, its velocity, orientation and all the good things. But actually, before checking in detail these two emitters, let's take a side step for just a second and check out a blueprint tool I built for that effect. You see, while building that splash particle system, I quickly realized I had to come up with a way to spawn particles quite precisely around this boat. And you can use mathematics to spawn particles in a sphere, cone, box and whatnot, but anything with a more, let's say, arbitrary shape, like a boat, and it gets a bit more tricky. Now, quick disclaimer, I'm sure there are a million ways to do a similar splash system, right? I'm only sharing my way, and it may not be the best way or the most performant way, but I'd say it gets the job done and you're more than welcome to iterate on it. Alright, so I'm sure you could compute quite precisely the way the boat intersects with water, sort of like a Boolean operation, right? And figure out a way to spawn particles super precisely along that intersection. At this point really the sky is the limit with Niagara, but I chose to go for a way simpler approach. And I was able to use a way simpler approach because I made a simple assumption. Yes, this boat would move around, like pitch and roll a bit with a buoyancy simulation, right? But I assumed it wouldn't be that much and wouldn't really affect how splash particles are spawned. Meaning it would be good enough if I said I want to keep track of what's happening around that line here and that's it, kinda like a single planar cut of that boat's hull. And this blueprint tool helps me do that. It performs line traces circularly at a given height and records hit locations and normals in a tiny texture to create a sort of circular map of that boat's outer geometry. And then I sample that texture in Niagara to spawn particles at these hit locations, but more on that in a second. That method, however, brought up two issues. First issue, that boat mesh is quite detailed, and there's geometry in the way. There's a bunch of details that I likely don't want to include during that line trace process. So in Blender, I quite arbitrarily chose the height at which that boat would most often intersect with water, and built a simplified profile of that boat's outer geometry at that height. And that's the mesh I used to perform line traces against, not the actual much more detailed mesh. Second issue, as you can see, using circular line traces led to an uneven point distribution. And due to the way I built things in Niagara, that uneven distribution would shift the probability of spawning splashes around the more dense regions. So there'd be more splashes around that area than say around here. To go around this issue, I came up with a bit of a cheat. I first perform circular line traces and record those uneven hit locations. If I then quote-unquote connect each hit location, that in a way gives me a sort of path, right? And by computing the planar distance between each hit location incrementally, I get that path length at each point. And so I can just walk up that path and place points along the way at a fixed interval. And the algorithm is quite simple really. Let's assume that path is 500 cm long and I want to spawn 51 points. That's 1 point every 50 cm, assuming I spawn one at 0 as well. So the second point to spawn is at 50 cm. Cool, we'll then loop through each path segment, get that segment's start and end points distances, and check if 50 cm is in this range. If not, keep going, but if so, then all we got to do is figure out where exactly on that segment this distance leads us, which is simple math. Using the path length at that segment's endpoints, I can normalize this distance to a 0 to 1 range, and use that normalized value to perform a lerp and get the in-between position. Third point to spawn is then at 100 centimeters, so march forward from there and repeat the process, and I end up with a uniform distribution of points along that path. Next step is to reproject those points on a circle and do line traces again. Maybe even rinse and repeat that process once or twice more, and I end up with a pretty decent uniform point distribution. So let's take a brief look at how I build this in Blueprint. First, I get the provided mesh sphere bounds plus a safety offset to compute the radius of that circular line trace process to come. Then I build a list of locations all around that mesh to start line traces from. Then perform those line traces and store the hit locations and normals. For each hit, I also compute that path distance I just mentioned. It's just a distance check with a previous hit location, really, and you keep adding to it to build the overall path length, right? Now comes the time to spawn points uniformly along that path, so do that. First, get the path overall length, then for each point to spawn, get its increasing distance on that path, and just like I explained before, it's then a matter of looping through each path segment to march forward and find on which segment that distance leads us. And then figure out where exactly on that segment with that simple math to perform lerps on the necessary data and get the in-between point. Then reproject those uniformly distributed points on a circle. Here it's really just about normalizing that offset in local space to get a direction, multiplied by a radius, and you get that circle projection, and transform that back to world space. Then from those circular points, perform line traces again, rinse and repeat, and voila! Once that's done, all I have to do now is to write those uniformly distributed hit locations and normals in a render target. I write locations in the top row of pixels and normals in the bottom row. That means there should be as many pixels in X as there are traces, so first resize that render target to ensure it is indeed the case. And then do a for loop to loop through each hit location and normal and write those XYZ vectors into this render target as RGB values. And voila for this blueprint. By the way, I released it as a tier 1 reward on my Patreon in case you want to take a closer look at it. I don't expect it to be super useful, to be honest, but I will let you be the judge of that. Alright, I then sample this tiny texture in that first Niagara emitter. This emitter spawns as many particles as this texture has pixels in X once. And these particles never die because I simply don't manage their lifetime, right? You may notice I don't use the particle initialize and particle state modules most Niagara emitters come with by default. Because, well, once you have spent enough time using Niagara, you tend to do things your own way when it makes sense to do so. Anyway, so here for each particle spawned, I sample the texture at a pixel in X based on the particle index, because again, I spawn one particle per pixel, so it's like each particle gets assigned its own pixel from left to right. So do that to sample the hit location on the top row. However, this is the hit location local to this mesh's origin, and this emitter is in world space. And so the particle's position actually needs to be in world space, hence the transform from local to world space here. Then here I sample the hit normal on the bottom row, I keep it in local space for now. Then I make sure to initiate the very few other variables I do later use in the update stack. And that's the particle spawn stack. In the update stack then, I first make sure those particles remain quote-unquote attached to the boat. Because this boat may have moved, right? And for now, I only have set these particles' positions at spawn. So they may have spawned at the right place at first, but they would remain there if I didn't update their position. And that's once again simply done by transforming the offset, sampled from that texture, from local to world space. That local offset, by the way, is stored in a particle parameter, so I don't have to resample that texture again and again. It's a bit cheaper that way, I suppose. Then I keep track of those particles' velocities in world space. And it's very important to do that per particle for this splash effect. I could say use the emitter's velocity and that would work in some way, but it wouldn't depict angular momentum. Like if the boat would just be static and turn in place, that single velocity at that emitter's origin wouldn't convey that information. But keeping track of velocities in world space at points all around the boat do create that angular momentum information, and it's quite critical to get these big splashes when the boat turns. Then here at those particles' world positions, I sample the wave height. I won't go over too much details here because it's the same exact code that I showed in the first video where I explained my buoyancy system. This demo here uses Gerstner waves, so sample Gerstner waves iteratively to get the wave height at these particles' world positions. Having the wave height, I then keep track of depth, and that's really just the vertical delta between this wave height and this particle's z location, both in world space. There's one tiny detail though, and it will matter in just a minute. I actually want to keep track of that depth over 2 frames. And so to do that, this depth is simply stored in a 2D vector instead of a single float. That way I can store the current depth in the x component and get the depth I stored last frame in that x component and store it in the y component, right? And that's it for this emitter. Now, if that's a bit much, let's take a breather and enable this debug custom module to see what we are dealing with here. Which is, by the way, a good opportunity for me to mention Niagara's draw debug interface, which is just awesome. It has tons of functions to draw lines and whatnot, and it couldn't be more simple to use. Anyway, let's see what we have here. First, it seems like I do indeed spawn 1 particle per pixel in that texture. Texture that again stores heat locations and normals to create a circular map of that boat's outer geometry. And these particles do move with the boat because of that local to world space transform I do on update. Which lets me keep track of velocities in world space at those points, and wave height and thus depth as well. Cool. And that's it for this emitter. On to the second emitter then, which is a little bit more involved, buckle up. In a nutshell, the idea is to continuously spawn splashes randomly all around the boat. Then upon particle spawn, using an attribute reader, read particles data from that other emitter to decide if a splash particle should live or die based on the velocity in world space, depth, and a bunch of other conditions at that location. So first of all, set up the attribute reader. All you get to do really is to create one here, drag it up here, and enter the other emitter's name. Then the trouble begins in that first custom module. For each particle spawned, I first pick a random float ranging from 0 to this other emitter's particle count. It may sound bizarre, but it will make sense in a second. So if this first emitter has, say, 64 particles, this random value for a given spawn particle may be, say, 48.3. It's my favorite number. Kidding, it's not. Then, using floor and ceil, I round that float to the lowest and highest integers, so 48 and 49, and frac to get the remaining fractional part, 0.3. And that actually points to 2 particles in that other emitter, right? And the fractional part serves as a way to interpolate data in between these 2 particles. So let's see. First, get those 2 particles IDs from those 2 particles indexes, 48 and 49. This is the only real confusing part about using an attribute reader, in my opinion. A particle index can be a weird concept, to say the least, and a particle index and ID are 2 different things. Oh, and by the way, you have to enable persistent IDs on this emitter for this workflow to work, okay? So get the particles IDs from those indexes, then using those IDs, get those 2 particles positions and perform a lerp to get the in-between position based on the fractional part. The thing is, I don't want this splash emitter to be quote-unquote limited by the number of particles in that other emitter, right? Else splashes may only spawn at those fixed points, and ideally I'd like to spawn splashes anywhere around the boat, hence the linear interpolation. That way I can pick a random float index that may make this splash particle spawn in between 2 particles and lerp values to get, well, the in-between data, if I may say. So do that for position, same for velocity, same for the normal, but it has to be transformed from local to world space here. And same for depth. Now, side note, these splash particles are not camera-facing billboards, and that's for 2 reasons. One, like I explained in the previous video, I have to take care of the particles' alignment and facing vectors myself, so they are not camera-dependent, and I get a matching result between the in-game camera and the top-down foam capture camera, okay? 2, coming up with custom alignment and facing vectors, well, it actually plays quite an important visual role in this splash particle system, to convey the idea that this is this boat's hull that's breaking the waves apart, right? It has a shape and all, and you'd expect water to flow and to create splashes in a certain direction. I'm not saying I did the perfect job here, but having large camera facing billboards, well, you just don't get that feeling. Everything blends together a bit too much. So I need to come up with a way to orient particles myself. Now remember, I already have a normal from that tiny texture these other emitter samples, right? A normal is great, but I would also like to have a tangent, which is what I do here. Taking a quick step back, here I lerp between these two particles positions, right? There I do the same exact thing, but with a tiny offset added to the alpha value. And that creates a second position, slightly offset from the first one in a given direction that once normalized gives me this tangent vector. And to summarize, it looks like this. I have that interpolated splash particle position and it's normal, then I sample another position ever so slightly offset, which once normalized gives me a unit vector, which is the tangent. And that's the two vectors I need to come up with a complete custom particle orientation, but more on that in a second. Let's first get to the end of this module. Here I finally compute that splash position with the possibility to slightly offset it along the normal. Note that it's offset in Z by the depth, which describes how above or below the water this wall position may be. So this depth offset actually projects the splash particle onto the water surface. And that's it for this module. Moving on, here I just have a SubUV module to select one of the splash in that 2x2 flipbook, nothing unusual. The rest of the magic mostly happens in that second custom module. Once again, you may notice I don't use that Initialize particle module most Niagara emitters come with by default. Because really here the only use I had for it was to set the particle's lifetime to control well how long those splashes last, and so really I can just do that on my own like so. Same for color, but it's more of a personal choice here really. There's nothing wrong with that Initialize particle module, and actually unless you're experienced with Niagara, I wouldn't recommend not using it. It's great and handles quite a few hidden things under the hood, like say generate a random number per particle for you to use in materials. Here I knew quite precisely what I needed and decided to go with a complete custom emitter, fully aware of what I was giving up by not using this module, right? Anyway, position. Well, I just apply the position computed here. This is quite arbitrary. I made the assumption that this module here wouldn't actually set any value. It just samples and outputs values, which are then passed along here, and this module is responsible to actually set them, okay? Moving on, here get that velocity's amplitude and direction once and store them in local variables. Directions that I can then compare with the normal using a dot product. So assuming the boat would move forward in a straight line, these particles would all have the same velocity in world space, right? And that dot product lets me know where splashes should be generated just from that velocity alone. It's like, here's a bunch of forward velocity, but only on the forward facing part of the boat, which is where water is pushed out of the way, right? Moving on, using the depth, I compute the submerged volume of a sphere at the splash location. Yes, I use the same exact principle as in my buoyancy system. This volume tells me how much water is displaced at that location, well, a very rough approximation at least. And if you think about it, the more water displaced, technically the more splash to generate, because that water has to go somewhere, it has to be pushed out of the way, right? So computing a spherical approximation of how deep the boat is submerged at that splash location is a great indication of how big of a splash to generate, I think. However, this submerged volume might only generate splashes when it's being submerged in the water, because once submerged, well, that water has moved out of the way, and if it's going out of the water, well, that creates a void, and water will fill that void, right? So probably no splashes either way. Thus, why, rather than relying on the actual submerged volume, I compute the rate of change of that submerged volume, and that's why I keep track of the depth over 2 frames in that first emitter. So I can compute the current submerged volume at that location and the previous submerged volume and derive a rate of change, and also check if that volume is actually pushed against the water, if that makes sense. And at that point I have all that I need to decide what to do with this splash particle. First of all, should there be a splash particle at all at this location and at this time? Again, I don't control when to spawn a splash. Splashes are constantly spawned. I just control if one gets to leave upon spawn. And that's done here by checking a bunch of criteria. So I assume splashes would be generated in 2 ways. Either by an increasing water displacement, or by the boat moving through the water. Both should move water out of the way. So that's the two things I check here using threshold values. Is speed high enough to generate a splash, however small it may be, or is water displacement high enough? Regardless, it has to be generated close enough to the water surface. And that's to prevent splashes from being spawned when the boat is airborne, for instance. And I also prevent splashes from being spawned based on these dot product results I mentioned just a minute ago. This is quite arbitrary, but without it, the splash effect is a bit much, and there's also quite a few splashes around the back of the boat that I didn't like, so I decided to get rid of them that way. Then, having decided if a splash particle is to live or die, I compute its size. It's a waste of computation if that particle is to die, obviously, but I'm not sure it could be avoided. Maybe using an if statement of some sort to get an early exit, I'm not sure. In any case, this is not likely to make any difference performance-wise. This emitter costs something like 0.01 millisecond on the GPU, so it's quite cheap. Anyway, that splash size is also based on a bunch of conditions. The faster the boat moves through the water, the bigger it is. That's modulated by this movement along normal, again that dot product I mentioned earlier. Then it's further modulated by the depth and the rate at which water is increasingly displaced. It's all driven by curves, so you can fine-tune the splash size quite precisely. Finally, I just ensure that size doesn't exceed a maximum value here. Then comes the time to compute that splash initial velocity, which is well directly related to the velocity sampled from that other emitter, right? But there's actually quite a bit of cheats done here to get the desired look. For instance, I actually only care about the planar velocity here, and ensure the vertical velocity is always somewhat up relative to the speed. Then I add some extra velocity based on the water displacement, in a direction that is arbitrarily chosen to be in between an upward vector and the boat's normal sampled from that other emitter. Finally, I also add some extra sideways velocity to push water to either side of the boat. Honestly, I wish this overall setup was a bit more physically based, if I may say. Here, for me, it's too much of fine-tuning very arbitrary values in made-up directions, but it ended up working well enough in the end, so I guess it's not that terrible. And last thing I do in this custom module is to store the normal and tangent sampled and computed in that first custom module, right? Which serve as the initial particle alignment and normal vectors, because again, I don't want to have camera-oriented billboards. I want to control the way particles are oriented myself. And that's a good chunk of the effect really. What happens during the update stack is then quite basic. Scale up sprite size over time. Oh, actually one thing that helped was to lower the particle pivot. Scaling splashes from their center point looked wrong to me, but scaling them from a much lower pivot point made much more sense and looked way better. So yeah, do that, then here scale the alpha channel to drive this material's masked opacity using an erosion method. Then I'll get to that module last, then apply some gravity, drag, solve forces and velocity. So actually the only custom module in the update stack is that one, which is super simple. It's a bit of a cheat again. Assuming I have this sprite alignment vector pointing that way, I take its Z component and decrease it, renormalize, and voila, now it's pointing that way. Do that over time at a given rate, and having the pivot point down there, that makes a splash particle rotate like so. Which could be improved, I suppose, but oh well, I thought it looked decent enough. And voila for the second emitter and this complex custom-made splash system. Hopefully that made sense. It was really a hard subject to deconstruct, if I may say, and a complicated video to make, so yeah, I really did my best, and I hope you could learn a couple things along the way. Now, to conclude this video, let's take a brief look at that splash particle material. The main takeaway here is that I use a particle SubUV node to randomly pick a splash texture in that 2x2 flipbook texture. Once for the opacity mask, which is simply eroded using a subtract node. By the way, the material is a masked material using desired opacity. And one more SubUV texture for the normal. It has a plain white color, some pixel depth offset, specular, roughness, and some SSS. It's overall super simple. The only thing that stands out is that 2-in-1 material trick I explained in the previous video for the foam capture, right? So I sample the wave height to generate that intersection map I talked about in that foam breakdown video, but I also use it to mask splashes underwater. else you'd see those splash particles falling and falling for some time underwater, gaining speed as if airborne, and it would look weird. It'd be possible to create a 2-in-1 particle material and create some sort of transition state where those splashes become bubbles underwater, but it's a bit tricky to handle when they resurface, and so I decided to scrap the idea. This project took me long enough to build as is, so maybe for another time. And voila, that's it for today's video, and that's the end of this 3-part series on this cool little boat simulation. Now it's likely I'll make a 4th video, because I have a few extra random things to mention, some stuff I tried that may be worth showing and whatnot, so stay tuned. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you liked the content. Please also consider joining my Patreon if you want to support me and see more content like this. This project is available as a tier 3 reward. I also released this can blueprint tool as a tier 1 reward, that buoyancy system as a tier 2 reward, and that foam capture system is also available as a tier 2 reward. Plus there's a ton of other projects for you to download if you do choose to join in. Any support is greatly appreciated. Speaking of which, I want to thank my patrons for the incredible support. Thank you guys. That's it, I'll see you in the next video. Please take care of yourself. Bye bye!